can you tell me a bit about your story and how it relates to the startup sort of sector in the
Yeah.
UK?
Yes, sure. So after school, I did an engineering apprenticeship at the Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell. And then I went to Oxford and I read engineering and economics. And then I was meant to go back again to Harwell to finish my apprenticeship. But by that time, I'd changed my mind. I thought England was full of very good engineers. We're very good at science and engineering, but what we're not good at is creating successful engineering and technology businesses. So I went to see my apprentice masters and I said, look, I think it wouldn't be a sensible use of my time and it wouldn't be a sensible use of the government's money because they were paying me to become an even better engineer. And they said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I think I ought to go to a business school and try to learn about how to run a business. And at the time, you just joined a business and you just worked your way up, and then eventually you became the managing director. But you never had, there was never any sort of formal training. And at the time, I believed, possibly wrongly, but anyway, at the time, I believed that there was, there was something you could learn about how to run a business. It's quite a complicated thing running a big business. Anyway, so they said, all right, well, if you can get into a business school, we will release you from your indentures. So because I'd signed up to do 1 year, then university, and then another year afterwards. So then I applied. So then I went to Harvard Business School to try to learn about business. And really, what I really learned was that there isn't anything to learn about business. It's all common sense. And it's a slightly sort of paradoxical thing to say, but when I went, I thought there was some mystery to running a business, and I wanted to discover what that mystery was. And really, what I learned is it's all common sense. You have to look after people, you have to keep your product up to date, you have to do good marketing, you have to look after your customers. All those things which are simple to say, but not necessarily, well, very, very difficult to achieve. Anyway, so then I came back from Harvard and I had a job. In fact, I rang up Mr. Hanson, as he was then, and I said, Mr. Hanson, I think you've got a very good management style, and I think you're very successful, and and I'd like to come and work for you. And I don't care what you pay me, but I want to be in charge of something. And if I do it well, I expect to be promoted. And if I do it badly, you can sack me. And he said, oh, you're just the man for me, you're hard. So I turned up to work for him, and it was a complete disaster. He sent me down to the report to the chairman of the agricultural division, and he viewed me as a spy from head office. And so everything I suggested, he kind of sabotaged. And so after 9 months, I hadn't been able to do a single thing, and I wasn't in charge. I was simply being an advisor. And I know by temperament, I'm not an advisor. I'm a natural doer. I like to get on with stuff and do it. And so I rang up Hanson. I said, look, can I come and see you? So I went to see him in London. And I said, look, this is just not working. I said, either the divisional chairman must go and I'll run the division, or I'd better go. And he said, well, I think on the whole, you'd better go. So that was the end of my first, and as it turned out, only job. So then I thought, well, I better try and start my own business, because then at least I won't be able to be sacked. And so I didn't have any money there, because I borrowed money to pay for my education. So I had an overdraft of £3,000, equivalent to about £30,000 today. And I'd also just lost my job, so I didn't have an income either. And I'm an engineer, and I really wanted to start an engineering business, but I didn't think I'd have a hope of raising enough money to start an engineering business, because it needs a lot of money to start an engineering business. You have to, have an idea for a product, then you have to, get a factory and machines and so on. Then you have to make it, then you have to sell it, and then you have to wait to get paid. And so it's a huge amount of money, and I just didn't think I'd have a hope of raising it. So I conceived the slightly unlikely idea of starting a restaurant, an American hamburger restaurant. And the big plus of a restaurant is that you don't need too much money to start. You can rent premises, you can even rent catering equipment, and you can open your doors. And as soon as you open your doors, you get paid in cash, and you don't have to pay the butcher for 6 weeks or whatever you can get away with. So a restaurant has the unusual feature of having positive cash flow from day one. Of course, there is a big difference between profitability and cash flow. And a restaurant can be generating cash but losing money. And I suppose, Harvard Business School education, at least I knew that much. And so I was sort of aware of the dangers. Anyway, so I wrote a business plan. And I suppose I was 24 or something by this time. And I had this overdraft. And I reckoned I needed £27,000 to start this business, about equivalent to £250,000 today. And so at that point, I was the archetypal young entrepreneur. I had a business plan and I needed money and I had nothing to contribute to myself. And so my problem was how to raise the money to get started. And so the first thing I did was to go and see my bank. This was 1971, and my bank quite helpfully offered to increase my overdraft from 3,000 to 4,000, so that I had something to contribute, which was quite good. And there were two venture capital companies at the time. One called ICFC, later called 3i. And the other one was called the Small Business Capital Fund, which was set up after the Bolton Report in the mid-60s. And so I went to see both of them, and they both turned me down after 20-minute meetings on the grounds that I was too young and I'd never run a business, blah, blah. So I then put an advertisement in the Financial Times, and it said, entrepreneur seeks £26,000 to start business. That was the £27,000 less the £1,000 the bank were going to lend me. Estimated value to investor after 66 months, £237,500. And the idea of putting that rather precise number was to, convey the idea that there was a business plan. And then it said, please write box number. Anyway, so I had 16 replies to that ad, of whom 6 were trying to sell me more advertising, but there were 10 replies from people who today would be called business angels, but the term did not then exist. So I sent them all a copy of my business plan, and then the first one of them rang me up, and he said, "Oh, this looks quite interesting. Let's have lunch in the pub." So I went to have lunch in a pub with him, and there was somebody else there as well who wasn't interested in the business. And it was in the summer, and it was a very bad meeting. We fetched our drinks, and then we talked a bit about the cricket, and then we talked a little bit about the business, and then we fetched our food and talked a bit more, and it just didn't feel right at all. So in the afternoon at 4 o'clock, I rang him up. And I said, look, that went really badly, and I'm sure you're not going to invest in me. And he said, you're quite right. He said, I'm just writing you a letter. And I said, well, can I come and see you again and do it properly? And he said, all right, come to breakfast. So a couple of days later, I went to his house in London for breakfast, and we spent 3 hours discussing the business properly. And at the end of that time, he offered to invest £5,000 in the business on the terms I was suggesting. And the terms I was suggesting were that I would invest the £1,000 that the bank was lending me for shares, and the investors would invest £999 for shares. And then the investors would make a loan to the business of £25,000, secured against the assets of the business, but not guaranteed by me. And so the effect of that structure was that if the business failed, I would lose £1,000 and the investors would lose £26,000. If the business went well, the first profits would get used to repay the investors £25,000 and plus their interest, which was paid in the form of directors' fees, which was tax efficient. And then after that, we'd split the profits 50-50. So the investors would get their money back first before I got anything. Anyway, so that seemed to me like a fair deal. And it clearly did to this investor, since he agreed to invest on those terms. And for anybody who's ever tried to start a business, I would say that is the seminal moment, when you've got an investor who's agreeing to invest in you on agreed terms, not because they're your father or your friend or something, but because they think it's a good commercial proposition. Suddenly, everything gets real. And that's exactly what happened in this case. So I then wrote to the other people to whom I'd sent the plan, and I'd say, I sent you a plan a couple of days ago. I haven't heard anything from you. Just to let you know, I've got, we're on the way. I've got £5,000 now, and actually no, then, well, almost immediately, so one of the others, a chap actually a friend of mine before who hadn't taken it seriously. He thought, oh, Lucius got this ridiculous idea of starting a restaurant, ha ha. But as soon as I got some money, he said, oh, well, perhaps this is, So he offered to invest, and then somebody else. So then I wrote to all the others. And in fact, then I put an advertisement in the Daily Telegraph saying I was wanting £26,000. I'd now got 13. And, would anybody who'd like to join in, there was still time, sort of thing. Anyway, so quite quickly, I was oversubscribed. So I had more investors than I had space for. So I took the four largest, 2 for 8,000 and 2 for 5,000, made the 26. And so then we were all set to go. So then I had to find a site, was the next thing. I knew absolutely nothing about restaurants, I may say. And it was
yeah, can I just ask what?
Yes, do.
I had loads of questions. I
loads
of questions on that. It's firstly, how did you pay for the second advert?
How did I pay for the second ad?
Yeah.
Oh, well, the advertisements were expensive. They probably cost, I can't remember what it was. It might have been £50 or something.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of money.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, but I had an overdraft facility, and
that's it. It's going to be used. Yeah. Yeah. So my main question really is why restaurateuring? Why restaurant?
Well, because, as I say, they don't need too much money to start.
So it's
if you get a restaurant right, they are very profitable. They make 100% return on investment per year. And this was an American hamburger restaurant, which I obviously was going well in the States, but they had barely existed in the UK before McDonald's had come.
Yeah.
And there were, very few. And so I thought it would be, people would like it.
Yeah. So it's purely pragmatic, sort of.
Yes. And it was. I was never going to be a life's work. It was. The idea was to begin to build a business and then get into engineering. That was my original plan.
Sorry, I interrupted. So
no, not a bit.
So you choose Bristol as your first site.
Well, that's just where the site came up. So I can't remember. There was estate agents that specialized in restaurants. And so I was on all their books, and they sent me sites. So I went to look at sites in, all over. And then this site in Bristol came up, and it was a sort of transport cafe in the middle of the city, and it was was bust really. Anyway, so that was the one. So then I agreed to take over the lease of that premises, and then and then I went down to Bristol. I didn't know a single person in Bristol, so I got a bed sit at the top of a fire escape, which just had a room with a mattress on the floor. And then I went into this transport cafe, and the owner, it's 11 o'clock, called all the staff together, and he said, "Here's your new boss. Good luck and goodbye." And walked out of the door. So it was. So then we ran it as a transport cafe for 3 or 4 weeks or something, and then I did plans, which I all did myself. Shutting it down and converting it and opening it up as a sort of it was an upmarket hamburger restaurant. So it was, anyway, I could tell you loads of stories about the restaurant. Probably not appropriate. Probably not.
I used to work in hospitality when I was a
Did you?
teenager, and then I did it after uni as well. So I know about the horrors of hospitality.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was yeah.
Well,
Um,
it wasn't all horrifying. It was very hard work. So we were
yeah,
open 7 days a week,
yeah,
12 hours a day,
yeah,
and or whatever. And I did everything myself. So I cooked and scrubbed the floor and
mm,
waited the table and paid the wages and bought the food and set up the menu. I mean, everything.
yeah.
It was very hard work, but I was I enjoyed it
Mm,
anyway. And after a bit, couple of years, I guess it was a very slow start. People had no idea what these hamburgers were, and in the end, I had to give away 10,000 free meals to get people to come. But when they came, they liked it, and so then they came back, and slowly it built up, and then the bank balance began to build up too. And so after a bit, there was enough money in the bank to pay for the second restaurant, and that was quite interesting. When I wanted the second site, what I did was I prepared a sheet of paper, A4, and it said, I've got this restaurant down in the center, and I'd like to find another restaurant up here. If ever you're thinking of selling, or let me know, and I'd be interested. And so then I spent an evening, and I went to all of the restaurants whose sites I would have liked in Clifton. And I went in and I said, could I talk to the manager or the owner? And I left the piece of paper for them. And a couple of months later, I got a call from the owner of one of these restaurants, who was French, and he said, my father's ill in France. I've got to go back to France. If you'd like to take over this lease, you could. And so I did. And so anyway, and that was a brilliant site. It turned out the first one had been such a slow start, but by this time I knew lots of people in Bristol. I'd been living there for 2 years, and we opened up at lunchtime, and we had a queue around the block at lunch the first time, and it was full, from the start, and so that was very profitable. So then there was enough money in the bank to pay for the third. So after 5 years, I had 3 restaurants in the chain. I can't quite remember, but I think the investors had been repaid their loan by then, and everything was going well. Oh, and each restaurant then had its own manager. So I then had time. So I had an income and time, and and a business which was generating profits. And so then looking back at the difficulty I had raising money 5 years before, it seemed to me that the whole process in the UK was very bad. My whole, in hindsight, this was quite a successful business. We had 50 people employed and blah, blah, blah. And, it all hinged on me raising a relatively small amount of money 5 years before. And I got turned down by the venture capital companies. And if the first investor hadn't read my tiny little ad, in the FT, which in those days used to have a whole page of classified ads, and right at the bottom was this tiny little 2-line ad, and if he'd been out of the country or something, there would have been one less business in the UK. And so I then started a second business called Venture Capital Report, which I started from above the office above the restaurant. And the idea was to make it easier for entrepreneurs to raise capital. And so the idea was that it would be a monthly magazine, and it would carry articles which would be about 5 pages long, as opposed to my tiny little ad. And the articles would have a description of the product or service, an analysis of the competition and the market, a CVs for the founders with photographs, and a cash flow projection for the business, and a suggested equities structure, and a name and address and telephone number. And then
what year was this?
1978.
1978. Gosh, that's very early then.
Yeah.
And dreadful economy as well.
Yeah, my goodness, yes. The top rate of tax at that time the top rate of income tax was 83%, and on top of that, there was an income tax surcharge for all unearned income of 15%. So it was 98% people paid in tax. And so there was absolutely no money to do anything. It was absolutely awful. I mean, that was the Labour Party at its worst. And Bennis Healy said he'd squeeze the, whatever it is, squeeze the rich till the pip squeaks was his famous line. And I mean, no, it was just catastrophic. Anyway,
I did have a question that I forgot, and
yeah.
I've just remembered.
Yes, yeah. Okay, go on.
Which was looking at sort of the historical context of going to Harvard in the 70s.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that I've read what they teach you at Harvard Business School and what they don't teach you at Harvard Business School. I love that, but like it's I've never been, but it's yeah. I was just wondering, were you getting something different in the States to what you were getting in this country, or was it? Would you get in that in business school?
Well, the biggest difference was in the culture. I mean, in the UK, people just didn't know about starting businesses. When I started my business, my father just couldn't believe it. He said, look, all this education. I mean, you've been to Oxford. You could join the Foreign Office. And I said, well, now I'm going to start. He said, yeah, he just couldn't believe it. I mean, he was I loved my father, and we got on really well, and he was very supportive, when I did it, but he just couldn't believe the decision that I'd want to do something as mad as start a business. Anyway,
let me corral you a bit. Because we're getting to the meat and potatoes of this, which is the venture capital report and how this extended. So would you say that? So yeah, tell me a bit about this, and then the next development through the 80s.
Yes,
and we can talk about this culture changing a bit, and then we can get to sort of EIS.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I can go a bit faster. Sorry.
Yeah. It's great. No, it's absolutely fascinating. It's
really okay. So anyway, that was I started Venture Capital Report. That was the idea. It was very difficult to start because it was a huge chicken and egg problem. When I was sitting in the office with the idea, to publish a magazine about entrepreneurs, well, how did I find those entrepreneurs? And in the absence of any entrepreneurs, how on earth was I going to find any investors? It was a real difficult thing to start. But anyway, I persevered, and I found some entrepreneurs. I charged them nothing, so it was free for them. And I managed to get the first issue together. And then luckily, the Financial Times covered it. So they produced a story about it. And 30 people bought the first issue. And then one of the businesses featured got funded. And so that showed that it could work in practice. And it slowly grew from there. It was a struggle. And then I did have a big bit of luck in that. The first issue was December 1978. And then in April 79, Mrs. Thatcher was elected became Prime Minister. And she was on the same tack that I was. She was wanting to make England a more enterprising place where people could raise money and people could start businesses and, cut this ridiculous rate of tax. I mean, taxing people at 98%. And that meant the government did, if the government didn't do anything, nothing happened. And as the governments never do anything, nothing happened. And the university and the government had exclusive rights to all research that came out of universities. So, just awful. Anyway, the Cabinet Office subscribed to Venture Capital Report, and she used to invite me to Downing Street to talk to her chancellors. And she'd say, you listen to this man, she'd say to her chancellors, and I'd tell them about it. So I gave input to the various government schemes that there were then to try to make things better. The business startup scheme and the business expansion scheme and the loan guarantee scheme and all the various things there were to sort of try to make it better. And anyway, and then Venture Capital Report ran for 25 years in the end. And at its peak, we had 975 subscribers. So that was pretty good. It enabled, as an entrepreneur, I had 10 people with my tiny little ad to choose from. Here was a means for entrepreneurs to get their plans in some detail, several pages of article on the desks of 975 people who were paying. And the fact that they were paying, meant that they were reasonably serious, at least. Because one of the worst things about raising capital is the amount of time you can waste talking to investors who are very slow to make up their minds. Often, just they like asking questions. It makes them feel good, but they've got very little intention of actually investing. It's very depressing. Having run Venture Capital Report for 5 years, it became very clear that scientists couldn't raise capital. So whenever we used to write up, quotes unquotes, ordinary businesses, so fashion designers or restaurants or hotel developments or squash court complexes or something, they would get interest from investors and possibly investment. But whenever we wrote up a new science idea, it didn't even get any inquiries. And the reason's very clear. People on the whole don't understand science, and investors very sensibly don't like to invest in things they don't understand. And so it was hopeless. And that's my own background and interest is in science. So that was frustrating for me. And so then, in order to try to do something about that problem, I started the first fund, whose objective was to invest in these science startups. But it actually arose because I was bleating on to a venture capital company in London. I was saying, it's no wonder this country is going to the dogs. You venture capitalists, you invest in safe things, and things that are already profitable and got sales and stuff. But whenever anybody comes up with a real idea, you will run a mile. And they said, oh, look, I tell you what, they said, if we give you £125,000, would you like to do 5 of these things yourself? £25,000 in prototypes and shut up. So I said, okay, you're on. That was the beginning of what I've done ever since. And I was, I had a real stroke of luck because the very first investment I made was a huge success, £25,000, and it repaid £500,000 to the investors after a few years. And the founder became a multimillionaire, and he became my biggest investor. And so every 18 months or so, he used to pay. By that time, I owned 3% and he owned 97% of the business. And about every 18 months, he'd ring up and he'd say, look, I've got, there's £1.5 million in the bank. I bought the advanced materials for the next 6 months. Shall I just pay a dividend of £1 million? So I'd say, fine. So he used to pay £970,000 to himself and £30,000 to me. And then he used to use most of his £970,000 to invest in my businesses. So he became my biggest investor. So it was all, and that success then enabled me to raise a second fund, and then a third and a fourth and a fifth. And we're currently on our 7th fund. And then just to finish with so then I continued for several years, maybe about another 10 years, to run Venture Capital Report, the magazine, alongside the investing in science business. And then in 1991, I sold the Venture Capital Report, and it continued to run, but I became the chairman and no longer the managing director. And in fact, I moved in order not to be a sort of the old founder, oppressing the new management. I moved into a separate office in the science park, so I was slightly removed, and the business continued to run for another 12 years. So eventually the whole business was sold in 2003. So it had a life of 25 years, and it was a sort of precursor of the business angel networks which exist today, and now they're all done online with crowdfunding and stuff, which is much better. But when I started, it was all on paper. So what I'd say is that everything I have done has been in response to a need. So first I've been on all sides of the fence. So to begin with, I was a young entrepreneur with a business plan in one hand and no money to invest myself, just my student loan to repay. So I experienced at first hand just how difficult it is to raise money, for your very first thing to start off. Then in Venture Capital Report, I was an intermediary, acting as a bridge between the investor and the person looking for money. And probably 400 or 500 businesses were funded through Venture Capital Report. And then for the last 35 years, I've been an investor myself, investing in these startups. So I've been on all sides of the fence. But by emotional sympathies are still with the founders of, who are trying to start, because they're the people who are really at the sharp end, and my interests align with theirs.